Welcome to our presentation. My name is Faye. I'm working with Michael and Claire, and we are presenting about the cultural miscommunications that happen. So, to start off our presentation, we're going to actually ask a question. So, have you ever thought that you were on the same page with someone, but then realized you weren't and everything went wrong? This can actually happen whether you're meeting someone for the first time, and you're either talking about a job, you're talking just about life, whatever's coming next. Or this can actually just happen with someone that you've known for a long time. So something like this actually happened to me a couple weeks ago. I was talking with my coworker, and we've known each other for about a year now, maybe. And I asked her, I believe on a Wednesday, what time she was working next Friday. And in my head, I was thinking next Friday means not this coming Friday, but the following Friday. And she was thinking that I meant this coming Friday. We both got pretty confused because we kept saying different times. And then when we finally went and looked at our schedule, it finally clicked and we realized it was a miscommunication and we just started laughing. So, this is actually an example of a shared fallacy meaning. In general, fallacies are flaws in the reasoning of an argument, and there are many different types. But the one type that we're speaking about is the shared meaning, which essentially is assuming that your words are received by the way that you mean them. And this can lead us to our next slide, which has the definitions of denotative and connotative. Denotation is the way that the word is meant by the dictionary, so it is the most straightforward way of the word. And then connotation is the intellectual and emotional way of the word. So a common phrase like ASAP, most people take that as soon as possible, meaning that day or that second, and some will think that it will mean that the end of the work week. So some examples, the way that these two languages and these two definitions work is home. So essentially it means house or structure, residence, but it can also mean family, comfort, love. Another word is cheap, which essentially just means cautious with money. But another way to interpret that is meaning broke. It can also mean a negative feeling, um, or a negative connotation of poor quality. So there are different words that can mean totally different things to different people, whether it's just the way that they were raised or they just have a different cultural meaning to themselves.
So cultural miscommunication happens more often than not when there are different backgrounds of two different people, when words, actions, or intentions are sometimes portrayed differently between, like a United States, heritage or a French heritage. That's an example of two different backgrounds that might be at odds with each other. For instance, for an action that can lead to a cultural miscommunication is a handshake. There isn't always a handshake in every country that means, like it's a greeting, like it is in the United States. And while small examples like that don't necessarily lead to, conflict, they can definitely lead to a miscommunication, which is something that will have to be sorted out later on down the road in your conversation. Cultural miscommunication with high and low context cultures. So here we're going to talk a little bit about how Hofstede's high and low context cultures will apply to cultural miscommunication. So high context cultures, such as Japan, they will often use less specific words in their communication, which just pretty much means that they don't have to take every little detail and explain it to you while they're talking to you. Which is quite unlike the United States. In the United States, we really like to have very small details explained or described to us in order to make sure that the job is done fully and completely to that person's expectations. We don't want to leave anything to question pretty much if a job needs to be done. And that is an example of a low context culture. The United States definitely is within the low context culture range. One more example of a high context culture is again from Japan, where they're more group focused. They are more focused on their community. What can take and benefit my community that I can do. Whereas in the United States, we're very into individualism. Like what can I do to get myself higher on the podium at work? What is good for me to do to progress in my life. We're not very focused on like, oh, how can I benefit my community? Today, tomorrow, and every day in advance. That's definitely more into a high context culture, not low context where the United States is. One example, a personal example actually of where I've seen high and low context cultures clash with each other, was when I was in second grade. We had this little boy, and he was great. We all loved him so much. He was awesome. But he was raised by parents who were of Guatemalan heritage, and he had been homeschooled before. So those are two really big shocks for a young kid, to go into a school system, after being homeschooled, let alone being raised in a culture that is a higher context culture. So he would come in more often, and he would share all of his food with us. It would be like a family style buffet. And a lot of us didn't understand why he did that. But looking back at it now, I am starting to realize that that's really because the way that his parents were raised within their culture and the way that they passed on their culture to him, and how sharing your food with your community is a way of showing that you care for them, is a way of showing that you're there to be a part of a community, not just a part for yourself, which was very much what the little kids in second grade do in the United States. They stick to their lunchbox and they don't really like to share. One more example of a high versus low context culture is how he would say different words in Spanish, and we wouldn't quite understand what he was saying. But we would have to ask, and on occasion he would say that there isn't a word to describe what he was saying in Spanish in English. We would ask him why, and a lot of times his answer would be, it's because it's more cultural. It's more because of like where I come from. And he would really enjoy trying to explain it to us, but sometimes it was difficult for us to understand because we didn't have a culture like he did with his parents who grew up in a Guatemalan culture. Effects on a group situation. So I have some different ways listed here that miscommunication can happen and how it can affect a group situation. So indirectness is the first one. So obviously, an example of indirectness is, on the lines of being passive aggressive as well. It can lead to making the conversation more confusing very rapidly. And it sometimes will draw the conversation on longer than it really needs to be. A second example is group hierarchy. So if you have someone who is, like takes the lead pretty much and assumes that they're on top, sometimes that can be bad. Sometimes it's good. But when it does turn to the bad direction of having a group hierarchies. There are people sometimes that don't get a say or don't have an input, and that can lead to some miscommunication about what needs to actually happen when you're in a group situation. Group orientation. So group orientation is another, I guess, smaller detail about effects that a group could have due to miscommunication. Um, this one really allows each person to bring what is they are specifically good at, or what is their strength, to the table to allow them to benefit the group. And the group allows it to use their strengths to benefit everyone, which is a really good way to make sure that your group has all the fields covered. Another effect would be verbal and nonverbal cues. So, verbal and nonverbal cues, as we've learned already, verbal cues, something that you physically say, right? Nonverbal cues are like, your actions, your facial expressions, the way that you hold, your posture, that kind of thing. Um, but a lot of nonverbal cues, you can cut somebody off when like a sign is kind of like a nonverbal cue, which can indicate to somebody like, oh, like this person is annoyed with me. This person wants me to be done with my part of the conversation. Um, but nonverbal cues can also be good for group communication. Nonverbal cues can also be, like head nodding, direct eye contact. That can also be something that encourages the person to continue to speak what they wanted to say. Verbal cues obviously, include the like, yes, go on. Oh, I understand that. I understand what you're saying. Those are some ways that it can both positively and negatively affect a group situation, especially when it comes to miscommunication within your group and within your culture.
Thanks, Feifei and Claire. My name's Michael Bell, and let's go behind the scenes of a classic contract miscommunication. Early in my procurement career, I was negotiating a contract for specialized equipment. After weeks of back and forth, we agreed to delivery upon completion. I thought that meant the supplier would deliver, install, and test the equipment. Fast forward, an email arrives, delivery complete. Please confirm acceptance. Attached was a photo of a dozen crates sitting outside our loading dock untouched. Turns out, my team and I pictured delivery as installation and testing, while the supplier saw it as dropping off boxes and heading off, whether that be for lunch or to another delivery. Suddenly, everyone's frustrated. My boss wants to know why the equipment isn't up and running, the supplier wants to be paid, and I'm left staring at crates, wondering where it all went wrong. We'd fallen for the shared meaning fallacy. Each of us assumed our interpretation of delivery was obvious. If we had just paused to clarify, do we mean delivery as in arrival or delivery as in fully installed and tested, we could have avoided the confusion. Even better, using some standard contract terms like Incoterms, the abbreviations FOB, EXW, etc., would have saved immense headache. Or just even summarizing all these steps in writing could have been a help. This was a mistake I've learned from. And this isn't just a procurement problem. Language gets slippery everywhere. Think of it words like affordable, urgent, or even supportive leadership. Affordable might mean as cheap as possible to one person, but it fits the budget to another. Urgent can mean stop everything or get to it when you can. And supportive leadership, that can mean a helpful boss or a micromanager who never leaves you alone. This dilemma is called equivocation, using a word with multiple meaning and assuming everyone's on the same page. And then there's even a little bit beyond that, which is loaded language. Words like innovative, mandatory, or game-changing, which stir up emotions which aren't always clear or the same for everyone. The power and expressiveness of language can build understanding, but just as easily, it can build confusion. It's like trying to build a bridge from both sides of a river, hoping you'll meet in the middle. Except sometimes someone ends up in the water. The lesson, when you hear or use words like affordable, urgent, pause and ask, what does that mean here in this context? You'll save yourself a lot of trouble. So, what's the takeaway? Whether you're handling contracts, working on a team project, or texting family and wondering what as soon as possible means, the shared meaning fallacy is always ready to turn simple messages into mix-ups, but it's easy to avoid. Pause, paraphrase, and ask for feedback. Make sure your words land the way you intended and you've heard what you intended. Before we wrap up, though, I'd love to hear from you. How can you avoid assuming shared meaning in your own communication, whether that be at work, with friends, at home, at school? And then what's one practical thing you'll try this week to make sure you're really on the same page? Thanks for listening, everyone. And remember, in communication, sometimes the smartest move is just asking, did I get that right?